In an explosive moment that captivated live television audiences, Karoline Leavitt stepped into the spotlight and delivered a performance that was both commanding and precise, drawing a clear line between conviction and spectacle. Her presence alone suggested confidence, but it was her deliberate articulation and pointed clarity that took center stage. What began as a routine segment quickly morphed into a standout media moment, driven by her unflinching stance and undeniable ability to steer the narrative. From the first sentence, she made it clear that she wasn't going to play by conventional media rules. Her tone was assertive yet composed, never tipping into aggression, but always teetering on the edge of hard truth. With every word, she challenged the norms of entertainment culture, pushing back against what she described as hollow elitism and out-of-touch commentary. The audience could sense it. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a takedown laced with strategy and flair. The way she constructed her argument was meticulous. Rather than relying on vague generalities or emotional jabs, she laid out her points with crisp logic. She built momentum by highlighting the contrast between performative outrage and grounded reasoning. Her approach wasn't to shout louder, but to cut deeper. She framed the entire exchange not as a personal attack, but as a larger critique of a system that, in her view, often elevates mockery over meaning. She drew from current events and cultural patterns, weaving together examples that underscored her central message that the line between satire and cynicism had blurred to the point of distortion. With surgical precision, she dismantled the premise that shock value equals substance. The audience was stunned, not because of volume, but because of the undeniable force of her logic. The live broadcast format added a level of intensity that couldn't be replicated in print or post-production. There was no room for edits or softening. What viewers saw was raw and real. In moments like these, timing is everything, and she knew exactly when to pause, when to lean in, and when to let silence speak volumes. Her restraint in those pauses gave the audience time to digest, to react, to feel the weight of her words. It was a masterclass in communication, built on a foundation of confidence and clarity rather than arrogance or theatrics. She didn't need to resort to low blows or personal attacks. Her strength lay in the way she framed the conversation. What also stood out was her ability to anticipate counter-arguments before they were voiced. It was as if she had mapped out the possible reactions ahead of time and embedded responses within her own dialogue. This preemptive strategy gave her an edge, an ability to stay one step ahead while remaining rooted in her core beliefs. In Satma, a setting where most guests fumble with sound bites or retreat into rehearsed lines, she maneuvered with ease, adapting on the fly while staying true to her message. The reaction was immediate and intense. The live audience, social media, and pundits alike responded with a mixture of awe and disbelief. It wasn't just that she had taken control of the conversation, it was the fact that she had done so with poise and command, without ever needing to lower the bar. Viewers were left rewatching clips, dissecting lines, quoting passages. It wasn't entertainment in the traditional sense. It was something sharper, something more deliberate. In a media culture often defined by chaos and controversy, this moment cut through the noise. It wasn't about spectacle for its own sake. It was about holding the mirror up to a broader system of communication that often relies on distraction. She redirected the lens, refocused the frame, and refused to be sidetracked. This wasn't just a memorable moment. It was a strategic shift, and it left an unmistakable mark. In a moment that took viewers by surprise, Karoline Leavitt exhibited a level of composure and precision that felt rare in the fast-moving, often sensational world of live television. Her delivery was calculated, not in a cold, mechanical way, but in a manner that revealed a deep understanding of both the topic and the platform she was speaking on. With each sentence, she demonstrated that she wasn't merely reacting. She was constructing a message that had weight, direction, and unmistakable clarity. It wasn't just what she said that drew attention. It was how she said it. She managed to seize control of the narrative in a way that bypassed typical media performance. There was no attempt to blend in or to soften the blow of her argument with safe, neutral phrasing. Instead, She leaned into her message fully, with a tone that was resolute and anchored in principle. Every word was chosen carefully, yet her speech never felt scripted. It had the energy of spontaneity, backed by the strength of preparation. She wasn't just trying to win a moment, she was reshaping the conversation in real time. Throughout her remarks, what stood out most was the sheer force of her conviction. Rather than rely on emotional appeals or dramatic flair, she brought forward a firm and intellectually grounded point of view. Her rhetoric was sharp but respectful, challenging the underlying assumptions of the discussion without turning the exchange into a shouting match. This balance, being forceful without being abrasive, was the secret behind the powerful impact of her message. One of the most striking elements of her delivery was her ability to keep the audience focused. Live, TV can be chaotic, filled with distractions, interruptions, and reactive energy, but she didn't allow any of that to throw her off course. She kept her rhythm steady, her pacing controlled, and her message unwavering. Even when tensions in the room seemed to rise, she never once veered into defensiveness. Instead, she maintained a commanding presence, always guiding the tone of the discussion rather than being swept up in it. It was her mastery of framing that truly elevated the moment. Rather than addressing surface-level talking points, she peeled back the layers of the issue at hand, exposing the inconsistencies and highlighting the cultural contradictions that too often go unexamined. She made it clear that her intention wasn't to participate in a spectacle, but to shed light on deeper truths that get lost amid media noise. And that's exactly what she did, transforming a segment that could have been forgettable into something with lasting resonance. The real brilliance lay in her subtle shifts between assertiveness and calm. She knew when to raise her voice ever so slightly for emphasis, and when to let her words land in a softer, more deliberate manner. This created a rhythm that drew people in and forced them to pay attention. Viewers weren't just hearing her. They were listening, absorbing, and in many cases, rethinking. Her words didn't just pass through the screen, they stayed, challenged, and lingered. She also made effective use of contrast, drawing attention to the difference between genuine dialogue and performance, between meaningful critique and hollow commentary. Without ever needing to name names, she painted a picture of the divide that exists in media today, a clash between those who stand on principle and those who perform for applause. Her message struck a chord because it didn't rely on spectacle. It relied on truth, delivered with precision. There was no need for theatrics or shock. The power of the moment came from its authenticity. It was clear that she wasn't interested in scoring cheap points or going viral for a soundbite. She was there to speak plainly, firmly, and with a sense of purpose that radiated from every line she delivered. That kind of presence, the kind that doesn't scream for attention, but commands it anyway, is rare. And in that moment, it was unmistakably hers. By the time the segment ended, it wasn't just the content of her remarks that left an impression. It was the fact that she had turned what could have been a fleeting exchange into something much more significant. She proved that poise, clarity, and conviction still have a place on the chaotic stage of modern media. She made it clear that strength doesn't always come from volume. It comes from the ability to stand grounded while everything else. Karoline Leavitt's performance in that live segment was marked not just by eloquence or assertiveness, but by her uncanny ability to expose the widening gap between satire and sincerity in modern discourse. She didn't merely offer a counterpoint, she unearthed the deeper disconnect that has grown between audiences and the voices they're often told to respect. With each word, she challenged the notion that cynicism is cleverness, that mockery is bravery, or that detachment is the same as insight. Her argument was clear. At some point, the cultural conversation became less about meaning and more about masks. She questioned the underlying assumption that ridiculing ideas is the same as engaging with them. That message struck a chord because it forced a moment of reflection, especially in a media climate that so often rewards sarcasm over sincerity. Her voice cut through that fog with urgency, revealing that mockery without substance is, in fact, not harmless satire, but a distraction. From real dialogue, She confronted that cultural tendency head-on, exposing how hollow and performative it can become when there's no real foundation behind the commentary. What gave her words weight wasn't just the message itself, but the way she peeled it back to its roots. She didn't attack personalities or rely on moral outrage. Instead, she calmly and firmly asked, "When did we decide that making fun of everything was the same as holding it accountable?" Her questions didn't need to be shouted. They were asked with a kind of razor-sharp clarity that left no room for confusion. She was inviting the audience to look past the punchlines and actually examine the assumptions behind them. What made the moment feel so revelatory was that she didn't rely on emotional manipulation to make her point. She simply presented the reality of how deflection, sarcasm, and constant critique can eventually become a shield for avoiding responsibility or serious conversation. In doing so, she wasn't just critiquing a style of communication. She was holding up a mirror to the broader cultural environment that embraces irony but resists accountability. Her argument traced a kind of emotional fatigue that many viewers could relate to, even if they hadn't articulated it themselves. When everything becomes a joke, when nothing is sacred, when outrage is just another punchline, what happens to the issues that actually deserve our full attention? That was the unspoken question behind her every sentence. And while her delivery was polished, it was never performative. She spoke as someone who had thought deeply about this, who wasn't trying to win the moment, but to wake it up. Her observations weren't general. They were surgical. She pointed out how the blending of entertainment and commentary has left audiences disoriented, unsure of when they're being informed, when they're being sold a worldview, or when they're just being entertained. It was a critique not of individuals, but of an entire cultural posture that has taken hold, one that values cleverness over clarity, detachment over depth. In that moment, she dared to question whether we've become too comfortable in that ambiguity. She reminded viewers that communication, especially in high-profile public settings, carries weight. That dismissing complexity with a smirk or an eye roll isn't just lazy, it's irresponsible. Her stance wasn't fueled by anger but by something more focused, the desire to elevate the conversation above the easy laugh, above the viral clip, above the applause line. And she did it with precision, making it clear that this wasn't about silencing dissent or censoring humor. It was about recognizing when the joke has become a substitute for substance. Her words resonated because they exposed something people were already feeling but perhaps hadn't yet found the words to describe. That creeping dissatisfaction with a culture that sneers more than it thinks, that tears down more than it builds up. She didn't need to name the trend. She embodied its opposite. She offered a vision of communication rooted in principle, not performance, and that contrast was powerful enough to echo beyond the boundaries of that segment. What viewers witnessed wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a reassertion of purpose in public discourse, a refusal to let cleverness crowd out clarity, a stand against the comfort of detachment. Karoline Leavitt, with calm conviction and focused resolve, drew a line, not between herself and others, but between two very different ideas of what public conversation can and should be. Karoline Leavitt's command over the segment reached its peak in the way she predicted and preempted the reactions of both her audience and her opposition. It wasn't just that she had a message to deliver, it was that she already knew how it would be received and built her argument to cut off criticism before it could take root. That foresight, that strategic anticipation, gave her the upper hand in a way that few guests on live television managed to achieve. She came not just with points but with an entire game plan, and it was executed with precision. She didn't wait to be challenged. She addressed counterpoints before they were raised, weaving them into her own narrative in a way that made any follow-up seem redundant. It was as if she had studied the common rebuttals, the expected reactions, the well-worn defense mechanisms that typically arise in these kinds of debates, and she dismantled them in real time. Her approach was not defensive. It was proactive, rooted in the understanding that control of the conversation depends not just on what you say, but on what you prevent from being said effectively in response. The brilliance of her approach lay in how seamlessly she embedded these anticipations. They didn't feel like rebuttals, they felt like clarifications. By doing this, she made it nearly impossible for her critics to box her in or misrepresent her position. She offered full context before it could be taken from her, diffusing the odd, usual tactics that turn clarity into controversy. This wasn't about avoiding the hard questions, it was about getting to them first and answering them better than anyone else could. There was also a noticeable shift in tone when she leaned into this strategy. Her confidence was steady, but it took on a sharper edge, not aggressive, but fortified. This wasn't improvisation. This was someone who had thought through every layer of her argument, and the result was undeniable. She stayed 2 steps ahead throughout the segment. While others might pause or stumble when challenged, she moved forward, calmly asserting control of the dialogue and leaving little room for misinterpretation. Her ability to forecast the reaction wasn't just about intellectual preparation. It spoke to a deep understanding of the cultural environment in which she was speaking. She knew the buzzwords that would trigger resistance, the phrases that would be misquoted, the tone that could be twisted, and so she stripped her message of ambiguity while keeping it sharp and potent. There was no excess, no filler. She was speaking to both her audience and her critics, and she was doing it with equal precision. This preemptive strategy also allowed her to maintain an emotional advantage. When others enter a media debate, they often find themselves reacting, defending their views, clarifying their words, correcting misconceptions. But Karoline Leavitt didn't give her critics that opening. She refused to let the debate slip into the usual pattern of escalation and instead set her own terms. The conversation moved according to her pace, her structure, her rules, and in that space, she flourished. Viewers recognized the strength of her performance not just in what she said, but in what never needed to be said. The awkward retorts that often derail these conversations were absent, replaced by a confident silence that spoke volumes. There was no scrambling, no retreat, no hesitation. Every shift in the discussion had already been mapped in her mind. This was not just poise, it was foresight paired with discipline. And perhaps most telling was the reaction from those watching. The usual script of punditry, where the loudest voice wins or the most provocative line dominates, didn't apply. Here, the audience was captivated not because she was combative, but because she had mastered the room without ever needing to raise her voice. That kind of presence is rare, and it doesn't come from rehearsed lines. It comes from depth, clarity, and strategy. In the end, what truly set her apart was her refusal to be cornered. She didn't dance around difficult topics, and she didn't let anyone else define her position for her. She spoke with a kind of layered awareness of the moment, of the platform, of the likely reactions, and used that awareness to build a message that couldn't be easily taken out of context or watered down. It was a performance not of dominance, but of mastery. She came prepared not just to argue, but to finish the conversation before it even started. Karoline Leavitt's moment on live television wasn't just a fleeting headline. It was a case study in how clarity, conviction, and composure can reshape the dynamics of a public exchange. In a media culture saturated with noise, interruptions, and theatrical sparring, she stood out not by outshouting others, but by outthinking them. Her ability to articulate her message with precision, anticipate the opposition, and maintain command of the narrative set a high bar for public discourse. This wasn't about grandstanding or playing to a base. It was about proving that real strength lies in preparation, focus, and the courage to challenge prevailing norms without resorting to spectacle. What made her performance resonate wasn't just the content of her message, but the tone with which she delivered it. Calm, measured, and fiercely intentional, she demonstrated that being bold doesn't require being brash. She didn't dodge difficult points. She embraced them. She didn't react emotionally. She responded thoughtfully. In doing so, she reminded viewers that media engagements don't have to descend into chaos to be compelling. They can be intelligent, deliberate, and deeply impactful. Her approach served as a refreshing counter to the performance-based commentary that often dominates today's platforms. Rather than play into a predictable dynamic of provocation and outrage, she redefined what it means to show strength on camera. Her poise under pressure became a powerful message in itself. It said, "You don't have to conform to the spectacle to be heard. You don't have to insult to make a point, and most importantly, you don't have to back down when facing cultural narratives that feel overwhelming or entrenched. The aftermath of her appearance saw viewers reflecting not just on what she said, but how she said it. Her ability to walk that line between confidence and humility, strength and restraint, made her message all the more compelling. It wasn't about winning an argument, it was about elevating a conversation. That's what made the moment so memorable, and in many ways, so rare. In a time when many voices compete for attention through volume or controversy, hers cut through by being grounded, strategic, and sincere. She didn't rely on shock value or viral tactics to leave an impression. She simply showed up fully prepared, fully present, and fully committed to saying something that mattered. That is what left people stunned, not just by her words, but by the depth of her presence. Karoline Leavitt didn't just participate in a segment, she defined it. And in doing so, she reminded audiences of something often forgotten in the noise of modern media. That substance still speaks louder than spectacle, and that there is real power in mastering the moment with focus, integrity, and unshakable clarity.